Joel, you used to tell the stories before you were at, like when you protect journalists, you were daring journalists in very dangerous places.
I not compared to the other people on this panel. I mean, I worked I started my career in Central America, in Guatemala, and I covered Mexico, and, you know, I had a few scrapes here and there, but, you know, it was just a different time. I mean, that was the thing to keep in mind. A lot of the things that I used to do, I was a freelancer, and you know, I just go off and cover some story. And the thing that led me to do what I do as an advocate for journalists was this. You know, this was a time when, even though I was a scruffy freelance correspondent in Mexico, you know, I had this little card from the president's office that entitled me to be a correspondent, and you know, man, like roadblocks would disappear, and people would wave me into buildings, and I was treated like an important person, even though I didn't feel like I was. And it was just the visibility and the power that went with being an international journalist at that time. And of course, and everyone here on this panel will recognize this, really what I was doing half the time was just regurgitating what my Mexican colleagues were telling me, because they knew the story so much better than I could possibly know, and they'd say, oh, you know, we're covering this is a great story, and I would like kind of redo a lot of the reporting that they were doing, and they wanted me to do that because they were vulnerable, and sometimes bad things happen to them, and I used my position to speak out and defend them, and that's kind of what led me to do this work. But I mean, the thing that's just so dramatic is how different that, you know, that feeling of invulnerability that you had, that press pass, that magical thing that gave you this sort of force field, that's gone. That is so gone. That is just a different era. We can talk about that in a moment. But that is, you know, I won't, you know, it's just like a sort of a memory at this point.
What's changed?
Well, what's changed is you know, it's really a power dynamic, a relationship of power. People talk about, you know, the legal protections that journalists have, and of course those are important in international humanitarian law, and that's important too. But the reality was that journalists were just useful. Journalists collectively exercised this information monopoly, not as individuals, but collectively. So no matter who you were, whether you were a criminal organization, some capo, or whether you were a government official, or no matter who you were, if you wanted to communicate with your society or with the world, you had to go through the press. So journalists were useful, and it was their utility to all sides that gave them this level of protection, and of course at the top of the heap were the international journalists. But they're less useful. I mean, it really comes down to that. People have all sorts of complex analyses of what's changed, but the reason journalists are less vulnerable is because they no longer exercise this collective information monopoly. All sorts of actors, governments, non-state actors, criminal organizations, militant groups, they have other ways of communicating. And they have, so they're not dependent on journalists, and so that power dynamic has shifted. And that is why we're seeing record numbers of journalists in prison around the world. Governments aren't afraid of journalists, and record numbers of journalists killed around the world. Criminal groups, militant groups, they're not afraid of journalists either.
I expected a different answer. No, in a good way. You know, just watching all the dimensions through which CPJ and you personally have worked on this issue in terms of impunity for killers, mm-hmm. What seems to be a lack of political will in some governments, even though this is a diplomatic issue now, the non-state actors, the extremely lucrative business of selling people,
sure.
Many of them journalists,
sure.
And you guys work on all those fronts,
right.
And I suppose this power dynamic has shifted every single one of them.
Exactly.
But just curious, you know, tell us even a little bit more around, you know,
well, how do you overcome this? Well, I mean, I think that the one thing you have to do is take a step back and just realize the complexity of the information ecosystem in which we operate today. The number of people who are participating in this process of gathering and disseminating information from, you know, the most best equipped international correspondents working for major media organizations. And of course, there are fewer of them, but they're definitely still out there, and they definitely play a critical role to national journalists for well-established media organizations within the country, to the fixers and stringers and support staff that support international organization, to local freelancers, to international freelancers, to citizen journalists, to eyewitnesses with a smartphone. All of those individuals are participating collectively in this process of gathering and disseminating and sharing the information that we call news. And their vulnerabilities vary quite a bit. And so we need to develop responses tailored to these different constituencies and their different needs. And I think that's what makes this environment so challenging. We can sort of get into the tactics, and I absolutely agree. We released this, just to give one example, we released our annual imprisoned list. These are journalists imprisoned around the world. And, some of the, there's almost 200 journalists. This is near record levels. Some of the countries that imprison journalists aren't that surprising. China's at the top of the list. It's been at the top of the list for a couple of years, but many of the worst jailers of journalists are allies of the United States. There are countries like Egypt, which is the second leading jailer of journalists, Turkey, Azerbaijan, Saudi Arabia. These are countries where the U.S. has significant influence. And it should be exercising that influence, and it should be saying jailing journalists is unacceptable in terms of maintaining a strong U.S. relationship. And in the instances where the U.S. has done that, it's produced results. We saw journalists, for example, released in Ethiopia in advance of President Obama's visit last July, because the U.S. government put considerable pressure on Ethiopia to take that action.